Welcome. Thank you for joining us virtually here at the Maryland Center for History and Culture. This program today is presented by the Maryland Center for History and Culture's Maritime Committee, Pandemics, Pirates, and Prose, the Barbary Wars, and the U.S. I am Margot Copera, Public Programs Manager here at the museum. Now, before we get started, I would like to mention an important day coming up, March 25th, Maryland Day. The Maryland Center for History and Culture participates in this day by asking our friends, members, and supporters to join us in a special 24-hour Maryland Day of Giving fundraiser. Every year, we pick one project to support on Maryland Day, and this year, we are very excited to announce we are fundraising to conserve 100 of our 200 historic flags and banners in our collection. So be on the lookout for more social media posts and emails about our Maryland Day of Giving fundraiser. Also on Maryland Day, for the free virtual program we are hosting for all ages, Virtual Trivia Maryland Day Edition. Join me and my colleagues for 4 rounds of questions and live conversation with staff in our newest exhibition, Discover Maryland. Test your knowledge of how the last 400 years have shaped Maryland and its people. You can learn more about our Maryland Day of Giving and Giving fundraiser and the free virtual trivia program by heading to our website. Check the chat for more details. Now, for today's program, we are turning our attention to an often overlooked span of U.S. history, the Barbary Wars. MCHC's Director of Publications, Martina Kado, is facilitating this conversation with her own background in maritime literature, namely the sea narratives of Herman Melville and Joseph Conrad. Thank you for joining us today, Martina.
Thank you, Margot.
I think that I will leave everything else up to you.
Thank you very much for this introduction, Margot, and welcome to all of our participants and our audience here today. We have a lot of ground to cover today. It's going to be a packed conversation, so I suggest that we start with some brief introductions of our speakers. The first speaker to join me today is Dr. Hester Blum from the Pennsylvania State University, where she's professor of English. She holds a PhD in English from the University of Pennsylvania, and her scholarship focuses on oceanic and polar studies, book history and material text studies, Herman Melville, and 19th century prose. Her most recent book, The News at the Ends of the Earth, The Print Culture of Polar Exploration, was published by Duke University Press in 2019. And before that, a book that's relevant for our talk today as well is The View from the Masthead, Maritime Imagination and Antebellum American Sea Narratives, which received the John Gardner Maritime Research Award. Her edited volumes include the essay collection, Turns of Event, 19th Century American Literary Studies in Motion, and special issues of Atlantic Studies and the Journal of Transnational American Studies on the topics of oceanic and archipelagic studies. And also something relevant for our talk today, a scholarly edition of Horrors of Slavery, which you will find in our chat we offer in our shop as well. So that is William Ray's captivity narrative. Oh, my virtual background is blocking it out. So that is fascinating. Dr. Blum also contributes frequently to Avidly, which is a channel of the Los Angeles Review of Books. And finally, and most fascinatingly, she participated in the 38th voyage of the Charles W. Morgan, the world's last surviving wooden whale ship, in 2014. And in July 2019, she joined the Northwest Passage Project, an Arctic expedition tracking climate change. Hello, Dr. Blum, and welcome.
Thank you so much. It's wonderful to be in conversation with everybody today.
Thank you. Moving on to our next speaker, Dr. Edward Papenfuse. He is a longtime friend of this institution and the retired Maryland State Archivist and Commissioner of Land Patents. His PhD is from the Johns Hopkins University, and it's in history, but he also holds an honorary doctorate of letters from Washington College. In his position as Maryland State Archivist, Dr. Papenfuse conceptualized and initialized the design of the Maryland Land Records website and also the Maryland State Archives website, among his many, many projects that are impossible to enumerate here. And among his many publications, one of which we also have in our shop, and that would be the Maryland State Archives Atlas of Historical Maps of Maryland, are also In Pursuit of Profit, the Annapolis Merchants in the Era of the American Revolution, Maryland, A New Guide to the Old Line State, Magna Carta for America, James Abercrombie's An Examination of the Acts of Parliament relative to the trade and the government of our American colonies. And also, interestingly for our audience, he writes a blog about neglected aspects of Baltimore City history called Remembering Baltimore. So you can find that at www.rememberingbaltimore.net. Hello, Dr. Papenfuse, and
Hi.
Welcome.
Pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Great. It's great to have you. And last but not the least, because we will be starting our conversation with him, is Dr. Lawrence Peskin, who is also a longtime friend of our organization and professor of history at Morgan State University here in Baltimore. He received his PhD in history from the University of Maryland, and his recent research focuses on Americans in the Mediterranean world during the late 18th and early 19th centuries. Among his book titles, we can single out the co-authored America and the World, Culture, Commerce, Conflict, then Manufacturing Revolution, The Intellectual Origins of Early American Industry, and relevant for our conversation today, Captives and Countrymen, Barbary, Slavery, and the American Public. Let's see if that one shows up. Nope, my virtual background is resisting all the book covers today. He has also published an award-winning diplomatic history article on US policy in the Mediterranean, and more recently, articles on US interactions with Jews in North Africa in Journal of the Early Republic and American Jewish History. He's currently finishing a book examining the diplomatic, business, and social networks of 3 long-serving American Mediterranean consuls in Tangier, Livorno, and Alicante, and probably suffering, like many of our researchers, with the closure of archives and libraries and the dearth of resources to wrap up your writing projects. Hello, Dr. Peskin, welcome.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So let me switch to first name basis. Larry, I thought we would start with you, and just as an introduction for our participants here today, how are these themes of pandemics, pirates, and prose connected? Can you just walk us in there?
Right. Well, they're so tightly connected, and living through the last year has really opened my eyes, and probably others as well, to the connections. Of course, you always think of there are always pandemics, when we're thinking about the 18th and the 19th century. But I've paid so much more attention to them, over the last year. And I always thought of them in terms of public health, but the other important element is economy. And I think we've seen that really ourselves, that we have these two poles, or they're really not poles, but different aspects of public health and economic impact. And so we see that too in the 18th century. I kind of, the thing that sort of tied it together with me, and I'm going to try to share some slides here, but I do this all the time, but share is not your friend with Zoom. But here, I think you can see Matthew Carey. So our neighbor to the north in Philadelphia, Matthew Carey was one of the most important, if not the most important publisher, and also a very important author in the early Republic period. And interestingly, in 1794, he wrote 2 of his most important books, which brings us to the prose, I suppose, of our title in part. The first one is this one, a short account of the, I can't read it because of my Zoom, but I think it's the malignant
fever, yes.
The malignant fever lately prevalent in Philadelphia, which is about the yellow fever outbreak of 1794. And in the same year, another one of his really important books, republished many times, a short account, again, I can't quite read it, but it's The Difficulties in Algiers. And these two things, the difficulty in Algiers was pirates capturing American ships. And of course, the Philadelphia pandemic was the yellow fever, which, as we'll discuss later, I'm sure, also affected us in the Mediterranean as well as in the Atlantic seaboard. So it's a very nice visual representation of how these topics are really tied together.
Thank you. So because this is a maritime talk, we will be hopping back and forth between sides of the ocean. And for now, as we zero in on the Mediterranean world, which is part of your research, I was hoping that you could also set the stage for our audience today. Why is the Mediterranean 200 years ago important for US history? What is the distribution of commercial power, economic power in this region? And maybe we can explain what we mean by Barbary states for our audience, because we have so many participants from different walks of life, and some are specialists and some are non-specialists. So I thought it would be a good idea to maybe include that information right here at the beginning.
Well, I'll give it a shot. I think we're sailing back and forth since it's the 18th century and the maritime community. So we can sail over to the Mediterranean Sea, which I hope you can see here. The Mediterranean, you know, it's the middle of the earth, right? I mean, it's the center of much of Western history. And the famous author who really writes about it is Fernand Braudel, the 20th century French historian, Braudel, B-R-A-U-D-E-L. And Braudel's point, which I think is very germane, is that it's sort of a unit. So we can see that we have Southern Europe on the northern end of it here. We have some of Asia over here, and then we have North Africa here. And in many ways, these places are more similar to each other even than they are to areas further to the north and further to the south. So the Barbary states, so-called, would be typically North Africa. Libya today is actually Tripoli in the late 18th century. And then there's Tunisia over here to the left, Algeria, and then Morocco. These three over here, not Morocco, were technically tributary to the Ottoman Porte. And they were Islamic and viewed as very exotic, you know, by the Europeans, although there was a great deal of commerce back and forth. Morocco is independent, but also, of course, an Islamic state. And then on the north, we have these European areas that I assume our readers are more familiar with. Barbary states were well known for capturing European ships. And so that's a problem with the Mediterranean, is you're always at danger of capture by the so-called barbarians. Not very flattering. And by the late 18th, early 19th century, what they're doing mostly is redeeming ships and captives, which means that they're getting big settlements from the countries whose property they've captured. So for the United States, that's a real problem.
So now that we've zeroed in, and I'm glad we have this map so that our audience can see what we were talking about, what can we say about the specific involvement of the United States here commercially, and then in terms of Barbary captivity?
Sorry, thanks. Well, the United States it's important to remember that we're talking about the 1780s into, you know, the 1820s. The United States is a very peripheral world power at this point, and not well protected against danger in the Mediterranean. There's no real navy to speak of until well into the 1790s.
And it's lost the protection of the British Navy that it would have had as part of the previous constellation, right?
Right, exactly. So the ships before the 1780s, American ships were much better protected. You're absolutely right. Yes. So as a result, a couple of things happen. One of which is the first real foreign policy crisis for the U.S. is the capturing of American ships beginning in 1785. Two of them in 1785 by the Algerians, and then a number later on, which means that Americans are held in captivity, or sometimes it's called slavery, actually, which has interesting ramifications. Up to maybe 500 Americans held in captivity. And that's it's not just though that they're being held captive, it also means that it's very costly, because the Mediterranean is viewed as the next frontier for American commerce. Now that we're not part of the British Empire, one of the benefits we can have is to trade with France and Spain and places that were forbidden when we were colonies. The problem though is that these captures make it much more difficult to do that trading, and also much more expensive, you know, because you have to fund a navy at some point, but also insurance rates go up, people lose their cargoes, it's risky, and so on and so forth. So the hope is that the Mediterranean is going to be our economic salvation. And we sell a lot of stuff there, mostly flour, fish and re-exported goods like sugar and coffee from the West Indies. But as a result of all these problems, we have these two periods of warfare with the various North African powers. The first Barbary War in 1801 to 1805 with Tripoli, and then the second one in 1815 with Algiers. And you can see that this is a picture of the war in Tripoli, which I think is also our ad for this talk.
And the cover of Hester's book as well.
Oh yes, that's right.
So what do we know specifically about Barbary captivity? And there was a comment in the chat, I have to say, about my audio being somewhat muffled. So I've readjusted my microphone. I hope that helps. What can we zero in on the captivity aspect of the Barbary crisis, so-called? Would Larry like to say something about that, or? Well,
I think that's probably Hester's bailiwick, really.
But, okay. I thought you may want to add something. All right.
No, if I need to, I'll add it later. Let's let Hester take a whack at it.
Perfect. So Hester, we know firsthand what the experience of Barbary captivity was like for United States sailors, because they wrote about them. In his book, Larry discusses some of the letters that they wrote home and to diplomatic representatives, just trying to advocate for themselves and their countrymen and in being ransomed and being released. But in your research, you addressed the so-called first-person Barbary captivity narratives. What can you tell us about that? How many do we have at our disposal today? Were they written to be published? Were they written to be just read by themselves or their friends and family? What do they tell us on the whole about this experience 200 years ago?
Thank you. Barbary narratives written by captive American sailors, which stretch from that 1785 first capture that Larry mentioned through later in the 19th century from some sailors who were taken not necessarily by the North African state-sponsored piracy directly, but in some cases had shipwrecked on the western coast of Africa and had been taken into another kind of captivity that had some analogs with the captivity that people like Larry and I have been discussing and have done some research on, who were held by the piratical powers in the eyes of the West of North Africa. And they form a distinct literary genre. And I wanted to set the scene a bit for how that genre of writing came to be, this body of literature. Since on the one hand, you have, in terms of numbers, there are a total of a little over a dozen captivity narratives written by American sailors in this period as full published narratives, but there is a wealth of other writing done by captives, writing letters to newspapers back home, writing to family members, who then often publish those letters, exchanges with the various consuls that were working on behalf of the captives to redeem them from captivity through payment. And it's an interesting moment in the history of publication and print as well, in which non-elites, people who were not thought to be necessarily worthy of having a public voice, which could include people who were taken captive not just in North Africa, but Americans who were held captive by indigenous Americans. Later in the 19th century, African Americans who had formerly been enslaved, who liberated themselves from enslavement and wrote narratives of their experience. Soldiers wrote narratives, beggars, sailors. It's a genre of writing that allows an individual who is non-elite and not wielding economic power necessarily to tell their personal story. And the idea that sailors had a voice, which by the mid-19th century, with the immense popularity of sea narratives, such as Richard Henry Dana's 2 Years Before the Mast, or the novels of Herman Melville, and earlier, the many, many sea novels of James Fenimore Cooper, which are less well known today than his Leatherstocking Tales, but were wildly popular in the 1820s and 30s. The earlier period for the Barbary narratives of the 1790s and the 1800s, the early 1800s, was the first time that American sailors who are strikingly literate as a working class, literacy is necessary for sailor advancement. They had opportunity while on their job site to practice literacy, which is unusual for a working class. So sailors were engaged in a literary culture, and in writing narratives of their experience, they were both advocating for themselves politically, they were expressing themselves as members of a community who deserved care and attention. The 1790s and 1800s are a time within literary and social discourse in which ideas of sympathy were very important, of fellow feeling for others. This is not simply just about a kind of overwhelming emotional response, but recognizing the shared humanity of another by feeling sympathy for them. So sailor narratives would stress their availability for public sympathy, that sailors were not the stereotypical either drunk or misbehaving in port cities or louche or untethered to any kind of domestic sphere. Sailors were making the case for themselves as thinking and feeling subjects in a world in which the early republic was trying to establish itself as a thinking, feeling subject more nationally. So these narratives were designed to create a literary and textual, rhetorical, political world in which sailors' lives had value. And so in these narratives, sailors talked about the differences between what they observed in the months and sometimes years that they spent living among Islamic states, and reported on what they observed about Muslim habits and daily practices. They complained about their treatment, and they also made analogies to American chattel slavery, although those analogies are not direct and not perfect, because Barbary captivity, although often referred to as a form of enslavement, is not chattel slavery. Barbary captives could be liberated at any time through cash payment or through conversion to Islam, which the sailors at the time called turning Turk.
That's very interesting that you mentioned, because and the connection that you immediately made to Richard Henry Dana and Herman Melville, that is a pivotal moment where the perspective changes from something that we're more used to, the perspectives of captains or officers, to what you call before the mast. And just having prepared for this conversation, I found it striking that there are so many differences between, the letters that Captain O'Brien, am I right, Larry, writes and in their treatment. So that is a cohort of about a dozen, 10 to 15 captives who are kind of living a privileged life. They occasionally get a stipend from the US government. So, and even though they are in captivity for a very long time, they don't mention hard labor. They don't mention other, harsh circumstances that any sailor from before the mast would have endured, and that other perspectives of these narratives that we're talking about right now, Barbary captivity narratives from other perspectives. Because there was a narrative written by a doctor, and a doctor would have been considered an officer on board ship. So their experience would have been different than a common sailor's. So maybe this is a good moment to zero in on the specific narrative that we wanted to talk to you about today. And that is your edited volume of William Ray's Horrors of Slavery, The American Tars in Tripoli. What is Ray's voice? Is he speaking from before the mast? What is he telling us specifically about his experience? And how does it read? How does his narrative read?
William Ray is a trip. He is an incredibly cranky, vituperative, and hilarious figure in the early Republic. In many ways, he's anomalous because he speaks in a rather unfettered, some might say unhinged manner, but he's also taking advantage of a lot of the opportunities for finding oneself in print in this moment. Technologies of newspaper production and distribution at this time are rapidly advancing. And so William Ray is somebody who works as a merchant, but he also writes and edits multiple newspapers over the course of his time. And writing much of the content of those newspapers too, not just editing them, but writing most of the material. He is somebody who at one point had traveled to Philadelphia thinking he was going to achieve a newspaper editorship, but he was delayed. Somebody called him a professional martyr. He's always upset about something. And by the time he arrived in Philadelphia, he discovered that the newspaper editorship had been given to another. So Ray, in the time-honored tradition that might be familiar to our listeners today through the opening lines of Moby Dick, like Ishmael, who goes to sea as an act of suicide when he feels suicidal, William Ray contemplates taking his own life, but instead enlists on the Philadelphia, which is a US frigate that is sent to Tripoli in the middle of the Barbary Wars. And he is taken captive upon arriving in Tripoli. He watches the famous burning of the Philadelphia, which is the Philadelphia had been captured by the Tripolitans. It had run aground. And then Stephen Decatur, one of the American heroes of this conflict, leads a daring boarding party in the middle of the night that sets fire to the US ship that had been claimed by Tripoli in order for the Tripolitans to be denied access to its use. So William Ray witnesses this. He writes a narrative of his captivity that in many ways looks like other sailor narratives of captivity, but in terms of describing bad treatment, complaining about the food, also describing cultures, customs, and habits. But what Ray does that's a little different than some others is beginning his narrative with a 24-page poetic exordium, and by writing angry letters in verse to people. I'm going to share my screen here and show you a couple examples of William Ray's angry poetry, which is really one of my favorite genres.
Angry poetry, I like that.
More people should be writing angry letters in the form of poetry. I'll skip ahead for a couple of other images that I might be able to show you depending on our time and conversation. This is the frontispiece for Ray's narrative Horrors of Slavery, which has the long descriptive subtitle and was published in 1808. And this very lengthy opening poetic exordium to his narrative Horrors of Slavery ends with this very caustic and pointed stanza in which Ray says, "Reader, lay prejudice aside and let calm reason be your guide. If in the following then you find things not so pleasing to your mind and think them false, why, disbelieve them. Errors of weakness, then forgive them. And let our sufferings and abuses for several facts make some excuses. And when you're captured by a Turk, sit down and write a better work." So Ray's anticipating that some might be critical of his manner of writing and forestalls that criticism right away by saying that until you have been held in captivity, you yourself will not understand what this is like. And Ray also uses the form of this narrative to denounce abuses within the US Navy and US governmental leadership. He's really distressed about flogging, the practice of whipping sailors used as disciplinary procedure in the US Navy. Anti-flogging activism continues through Dana and Melville as well. But Ray is particularly upset that what he sees as the promises of US democracy are not being upheld in the way the US is treating its sailors and treating its captives. And so in the volume of poetry that he published several years later, which consists of many kind of conventional odes to seasons and poems that are elegies for people who have died. He also includes some angry political poems. Here's a snippet of one in which he says that those who think of themselves as Republicans should be ashamed of themselves. And they should be ashamed of themselves because America participates in the slave trade and in enslavement. 1808 is the year that the US outlaws the transatlantic slave trade, although obviously slavery continues in the US. And so Ray is less interested in Black people and the cause of equality for the sake of broader humanity. He's more interested in thinking of slavery as a way to condemn the abuses of US government. So Ray is one of the kind of original, we could think of him as an internet troll. We could think of him as a an old man yelling at a cloud or writing angry letters to the paper, but he's justified and feels a certain kind of righteousness in doing so. He's a remarkable and weird and hilarious person.
As are a lot of maritime writers, and there seems to be this connection between writing and sailing. It's also been theorized in literature. So just before we move on to the pandemics part of our conversation, I was just wondering if maybe you wanted to make some more connections between these, first-person narratives and they're kind of torn on multiple fronts. On the one hand, they're a historical record. On the other, you study them as works of literature and literary history. On the one hand, they are rooted in fact, but if we go further to Dana and Melville, we will find that basis of fact has been fictionalized. Could you speak to that and maybe some themes very briefly? Because what I'm hearing from William Ray's narrative, we can definitely see in Melville from criticisms of U.S. slavery, of U.S. naval practices. And to what extent can we say that Melville is indebted to these narratives, or how direct is this line from this Barbary crisis to something that we're going to see several decades later in what we now consider to be the pinnacle of maritime writing?
Well, this might be an interesting disciplinary question for Larry and for Ed, who are historians. I'm a literary critic by training. I work on literary history, but as such, coming from my training, the distance between a narrative of fact and a narrative of fancy, of fiction, is not always a very absolute one. Narratives, first-person narratives that are presented as truth, still nonetheless have their biases, their subjectivities, their various ways of framing things. The challenge for us as readers is to interpret the evidence at hand and make determinations about what those narratives can teach us.
And sorry to interrupt, they might also have a vested interest in exaggerating some of their sufferings to further their cause, right? Because they want to go home.
Absolutely. And in this period as well, even what we now recognize as novels without any asterisks attached to them would present themselves as narratives of facts on the logic that a novel was at its most moral, its most ethical, and most culturally important if it could convey truths. If the story itself might not be a literal truth, the novel itself could convey truths. So the distance between the fact and the fiction is not as important to me as the persuasiveness by which these narratives frame their accounts of suffering, their accounts of the importance of having sympathy or fellow feeling for the people who are writing them, and the difference in rhetoric between Dana's first-person narrative view before 2 years before The Mast, which was published in 1840 and was wildly popular and influential first-person factual narrative, is no less fictional than Herman Melville's novels in the way that it's organized. And so I think one of the ways sailor writing, like many other forms of narrative writing, becomes a way to have both the immediacy of personal experience as well as the entertainment value of a frame that recognizes that a readership is going to be interested in different aspects of that tale.
Wonderful, thank you. Ed, we started this conversation with talking about pirates. We've talked a bit about prose, and we opened our talk today with Matthew Carey and his 2 books, one about piracy and one about the yellow fever. I was hoping that you could tell us a little more about the experience of yellow fever as an epidemic, perhaps even a pandemic, on this side of the Atlantic, so including US port cities, including the West Indies. What was that like? What can you tell us about that in this period?
Let's share a screen, but I would also like to invite Larry and Hester to any questions they have in the process of what I'm doing. Feel very free to chime in. This is not an exclusive presentation.
It's a conversation.
It's a conversation. So let's basically see if I can bring up my slides the way I would like to. All right. Now I'm assuming that everybody can see this.
Looks good.
And so let's just sort of start with the fundamental problem for sailors, for the Navy, for the Merchant Marine, as it related to one disease that I would say basically scared them spitless. There's no question that the sailors, whether they were Merchant Marine or whether they were in the Navy, whether they were officers or not, were concerned with a number of diseases. Some of them could be characterized as pandemics. But the one that I think probably struck the most fear into sailors as well as to the ports to which they sailed was the question of yellow fever. And so we really need to sort of look at the role of yellow fever as a part of the everyday life of Jack Tar in the streets, or the officers who led these men. So what I'd like to begin with is that in actually a little bit off time period, because by 1878, everybody who thought about the problem was convinced that yellow fever was carried by the sailors, and that the sailors basically are the ones who brought it into port, and they were really the cause of it in sense of really spreading the disease. That, of course, was not true. In fact, it took quite a long while for them to realize what the problem really was. But in 1878, this woman on the left-hand side, Elizabeth Thompson, who was very wealthy, she lived, I think, in Louisa May Alcott's house, but be that as it may, she was funding a lot of good causes. And she was approached by a group of scientists who were really interested in trying to figure out the story as well as the consequences of yellow fever. And so she basically funded this study. And this study is the very first one that really said, okay, yellow fever is a nautical disease. Now, by that time, they didn't really know what that meant. That was left to this fellow on the right. Contrary to what most American historians like to think, it wasn't Walter Reed and it wasn't William Crawford Gorgas who did all this good work. It was basically Carlos Finley, a doctor in Cuba, because the whole problem of yellow fever begins in the West Indies and begins with regard to trade out of the West Indies. And the question is, you know, how did it get distributed? What on earth caused it? And at this point, by 1878, nobody really knew for sure. There were a lot of theories. Well, what Carlos Finley did was he looked at the problem from the standpoint of, you know, how was this disease transmitted? And he basically came to the conclusion by injecting himself, by being bitten by mosquitoes himself, and also working his way through this, that the whole question of transmission is really related to trade. It's really related to the Navy, but it's related to how the mosquitoes got spread around, but also how people who had the disease came into ports where there were the mosquitoes that could actually bite them and transmit the disease to others. Now, I'd like to back up now to really answer Martina's question. As a result of that first study, and then one done in 1909, everybody can find out pretty easily where the epidemics or the pandemics or the whole spread of yellow fever took place chronologically in America, and particularly along the coastal cities as a naval disease. And this particular chart is one that you can easily come to and look at in terms of the places that were most affected. Clearly, the start of it, as far as America was concerned, was in Philadelphia, in New York, to a much lesser extent in Boston. And then, of course, the port that was hurt the most over the longest period of time was New Orleans, which, of course, began as Spanish and then was French, and then was very much connected to the West Indies trade. So if we looked at the different epidemics, we have talked just very briefly about Matthew Carey. Well, Matthew Carey was understood and was a part of the terror that was related to the epidemic that hit Philadelphia in 1793. And also it is an epidemic that hits Baltimore at approximately the same time. Now, the important thing to know about those two port cities is that they have an extensive trade with the West Indies. And they have an extensive trade, especially with those islands that seem to have been most, and those places that were most adversely affected by yellow fever. So if we talk about Crawford for a moment, I think it's really very important to realize that as much as he was admired for his maps and as much as he was admired for what he had to say about yellow fever, he was very disparaging of those who actually bore the brunt of nursing people through the yellow fever epidemic in Philadelphia in 1793. And that was the Black population. And so this is probably one of the most important reactive narratives with regard to what happens to a community when yellow fever hits it as an epidemic. And it is written by two distinguished Black preachers, both of whom were in the same church organization to begin with and then led their separate congregations, but probably the one that is least or less known of the two is Reverend Absalom Jones. Both of these, of course, were Black ministers in Philadelphia. When we look at the question of the center of where this yellow fever came from, Cuba becomes the most important place to sort of focus your attention. And of course, Cuba is really important in not only in the commodities trade, but it's extremely important in the slave trade, and particularly what came to be known as the illegal transatlantic slave trade, which continues on much longer and relates to America much longer than the 1808 so-called prohibition against importation of slaves. So in terms of maps of looking at things, this in fact is a Carey map of the West Indies. And it really shows all of the places might have been important places to learn about how yellow fever came to affect the merchant marine and came to affect the Navy as well.
The maritime world. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, go ahead, please.
I said the maritime world. It's fine. I'm just thinking out loud.
But what I'd like to do is to move to the first Barbary War, or the 1804, 1805, because at the time that these over 300 people from the Philadelphia were incarcerated or in slavery or were basically in Tripoli, there were major outbreaks of yellow fever in the Mediterranean. They were centered at, and this is 1804 now, they were centered at Cadiz, which was a major port as far as Spain's trade with their colonies in Central and South America, and also the West Indies. Gibraltar, the place that all of the ships had to pass through in 1804, had a horrendous outbreak of yellow fever. And then, of course, a lot of the trade from America, basically the colonies or former colonies along the East Coast, was centered at Leghorn, which was on the Italian coast. Now, Leghorn was a free port, and it was a place where American merchants could basically get their commodities, as Larry pointed out, as fish, or could have gotten their, that's from the Boston area and coming out of Boston, but even more importantly, that's where the competing armies in the Napoleonic Wars could actually acquire the kind of flour that they needed to feed their armies. So Leghorn becomes a really rather interesting place in terms of its part of the structure of trade, but also the reception of both naval vessels and also the reception of commercial vessels. And it has a horrendous outbreak, practically decimates the city of yellow fever in 1804. Now, this is all the time that over 300 sailors are in captivity in Tripoli, and the Philadelphia, of course, is sent to, shall we say, blockade and do whatever damage it can to Tripoli, gets stuck on the rocks, and so, what happens is, of course, all of its passengers, all of its men are, both officers and crew, are pulled into Tripoli and kept in captivity for 19 months, beginning in October of 1803 through all the epidemics that are going on throughout the Mediterranean for 19 months until they're finally set free by the United States paying a pittance of a basically.
Do I see
and I think
Larry
I should
unmuting
break
himself?
in here.
Yes.
Because I mean, I was going to say a few things about the Mediterranean. That's so helpful to set the stage there. Do you mind, Martina,
Absolutely, go ahead.
if I add to the discussion of the Mediterranean? So one of the I'm writing a book on Americans in the Mediterranean, as I said, which is almost complete. One of the places I look at is Livorno, which is Leghorn. The yellow fever came to be known as the American fever in the Mediterranean. And one of the things that I wanted to point out about yellow fever in the Mediterranean is as I think Ed's implying, it's not just a public health issue, although it's a terrible disease. I mean, it's really pretty horrific, and that's one of the reasons why people are so afraid. But also, you know, it's an economic problem because it hinders all of this American shipping. And I want to add that there is flour going into Livorno for sure, but the big thing that Americans are shipping there is actually West Indian re-exports, which would be coffee, sugar, and so forth. And this implies trafficking to the West Indies, which means that in addition to the US, you're also picking up mosquitoes, you know, when you're in the West Indies. So the American ships are really, they're pretty dangerous. And the officials in the Mediterranean very much try to find a way to mitigate that danger. So Ed, if you could stop sharing, I can't share my screen while yours is up there.
Sure, we have to. Yes.
Appreciate it, thanks.
Go ahead.
And so they built quite an infrastructure in the Mediterranean to try to deal with not only the yellow fever, but you know, other diseases. And they have, they spend a lot of money on public health departments in the 18th and 19th century. So for example, here in Livorno, which again is Leghorn in Italian, you can see they built a massive lazaretto at this time. And a big part of this is for quarantine. So when American ships, when any ship would come, they'd be quarantined for generally 14 days, which is where the term comes from. But when they have any sign that there might be yellow fever, they can be quarantined for much, much longer. And one of the problems that the consul there encounters is that all American ships are assumed to have yellow fever, whether they're from Philadelphia or Boston or anywhere else. And that costs a lot of money because these goods can't be sold. They're stuck in the lazaretto, they get sold. The captains have to pay for their storage. If they're perishable goods, they may not last through the quarantine. So it's also a major economic issue, as we find with these pandemics, as well as a public health issue.
Yeah, Larry, if I may, I also when you're talking about this, you also can't forget that the real major cause of the importation of both the mosquitoes and the whole question of sailors coming from the West Indies was a Spanish problem. And that really, that complicates matters. The Americans are blamed in Livorno, but they're not blamed in Cadiz. They're not blamed as much.
Well, and I don't do much on Cadiz, but I'm writing, one of the cities I'm writing about is Alicante, which is in the eastern end. Right. And the first introduction of yellow fever into Alicante is 1801. And it's pretty clear that that actually comes from an American ship. And what they do is they ban all American shipping for a time in 1801, which is a real problem for American merchants. But it's also a huge public health problem in Alicante. It's a city of 25,000 people. Yes. And in 1801, 5,000 of them died from yellow fever. So you can understand, why the officials are taking all of these procedures, all of these actions to try to mitigate the spread. And one last slide is something else that they do, which is any paper products, letters, et cetera, that go in and out of the yellow fever zone, they get dipped in vinegar. And the idea is that vinegar will purify. And so it also makes it very difficult sometimes for us to even study these events, because as you can see, this is a letter that's coming out of Gibraltar. This is actually during the plague, not the yellow fever, but same thing. And you can see it's quite difficult to read some of these things because of what the vinegar does to the paper. But the larger point being that this is a serious public health problem for the Mediterranean, and it becomes a serious economic problem for American shippers.
Yes, without a doubt. And if I may, I agree with you about that one ship in 1801, because that becomes the focus of the complaint that this is really coming from America. But the truth of the matter is that much of the spread of yellow fever and the problem of yellow fever is a Spanish problem. It's just simply, I mean, we call it the Spanish influenza. When it comes to 1918, it's surprising that they didn't at least label some of the problem of yellow fever as being the Spanish yellow fever.
Well, of course, Cuba was a Spanish colony. And, you know, when you talk American fever, you can be talking about Havana as well as Philadelphia, really.
There's no question about that. But if I may, I just have a couple more that I'd like to sort of go through.
Yes, we should be kind of drawing to a close slowly, and we are starting to receive questions. And this is also a good moment to encourage our other participants to start sharing their questions, because we can hopefully get to them very soon. But yes, Ed, let's
just basically, if there was anything fortunate about the 300 plus sailors from the Chesapeake being in Tripoli, is that they were not exposed to yellow fever. And so while all this was going on basically around them, that was not a fear that they had. This is just the classic showing of what happens in the when basically a ship of relative importance, the Macedonia, is captured, which is later during the War of 1812. But I come back to the Macedonia basically because the Macedonia was captained by James Biddle. And those of you who have read about the incarcerations in Tripoli know that Biddle was one of the sailors that was in fact incarcerated in Tripoli. And he comes back to command the Western, or is in the West Indies, and commanding a ship that was taken from the British called the Macedonia. And that almost the whole crew came down with yellow fever and completely debilitated his expedition, largely because they had caught it in the West Indies. And I'd like to end basically by saying, wait a minute, there were some people who recognized that the mosquito was in fact the carrier of the disease, but they weren't listened to. And probably one of the most important ones was John Crawford, who was a doctor in Baltimore, whose daughter published a literary magazine, and in which he published his theories. The magazine was called The Observer, in which he published his theories with regard to the animals, meaning what Leeuwenhoek actually saw through his microscope as being really the transmitter of the disease. Now, he thought that these little germs actually got in under the skin and actually, rather than it being a mosquito, literally sticking its saliva in and passing the disease on. So as we come to sort of take a look at this total picture, yellow fever figures on many different levels. It figures as fear. For example, Ray talks about the fact that he was in New York and the fear of yellow fever drove him out of New York towards Philadelphia. Little did he know that Philadelphia was going to be a problem too. So as we sort of look at this overall business of pandemics, you have to look at it as being something that is carried by American ships, is carried by Spanish ships, but we still don't know why it broke out and then stopped. We still don't know why it was as frequent in some periods and not so frequent in others. And I think that really relates to the question of the chicken and the egg with regard to, where does this come from? Does it come from monkeys first and as incubators in Africa and then passed on? How do the mosquitoes get distributed around? Why is it only one kind of mosquito or at least two kinds of mosquitoes that actually carry it? The timing, all of this is a problem of sort of looking at, when it affects and how it affects. But with that, I'll stop.
Thank you so very much, Ed, and thank you to our speakers. I would once again like to invite our audience to start asking questions. And I think one of our first questions actually jibes with what was supposed to be my last official question for Hester. So I'll blend the two in a way that brings us maybe closer to the present day. And, we didn't live in the late 1700s, and maybe not all of us have had a seafaring experience, but there is something that we do share with with the sailing experience, and that is the isolation that we have been through in the last year. So let me start by a comment from our friend John Emond. He says, this may be a stretch, but is there a possible comparison between the isolation of captivity to the pirates or early 19th century isolation due to pandemics then? And what have we gone through this past year with COVID pandemic isolation? I'm thinking of how the human spirit felt constrained then and now. So it might be a question, we have 5 minutes left. It might be a question for all 3 of our participants, but I was going to go to Hester first because she's researched polar exploration, not only been a part of a polar expedition, but she's researched polar exploration in terms of what sailors did to pass the time. And you wrote a little bit about it. Maybe you can share that with us. What did they do in isolation?
With pleasure, and I appreciate the question because I think many of us have thought back to our historical examples of scenes of relative isolation and thinking through this last year. And in many ways, because the Americans who were held captive in North Africa are able to send correspondence for the most part, they're able to be in communication with others. That rhymes with a lot of the ways that people today have coped with social distancing and certain forms of social isolation. We can be in correspondence with people. The polar sailors that I have been studying more recently for 19th century and early 20th century expeditions until the arrival of wireless technology to the coast of Antarctica in the early 20th century had no contact with anyone outside of the ship. And so they engaged in many of the standard shipboard practices of passing time, which involve doing shipboard theatricals, doing a lot of writing, just again, for among their own circulation. But one of the things that polar sailors did, which is a very unusual genre for sailors to participate in, is to make newspapers. Sailors don't usually write newspapers, but in the polar darkness and isolation of these polar winters, they had printing presses aboard ship and would make newspapers and eventually books. And so that kind of creativity is something during the pandemic I've really admired and envied, since I have found that my own ability to write and circulate has been impacted in a way that polar sailors found a good way around pretty quickly. I'm not sure if Ed or Larry have found similar limitations in the creativity of the pandemic time.
Larry, did you want to say something?
I didn't want to speak to creativity so much, but the third place, I'm looking at Alicante, Livorno, and Tangier in Morocco. And they have, in addition to yellow fever there, they have the plague. Although some people feel it might actually be yellow fever. But be that as it may, the consul there that I am writing about, James Simpson, he's stuck in a very virulent outbreak of plague there. And he's stuck in his country estate for over a year. I mean, it's a nice house, but he didn't leave it for over a year because of the plague. He writes letters back and forth. They're soaked with vinegar like this, and there's no transport either. There's only one European ship that comes in and out of Tangier once a month from Gibraltar during the plague. I mean, they don't want to see any plague people or touch any of their things or any of that. So in that sense, it's very isolating. I don't think it has a creative tension that it does maybe for some of the other captives, but it's incredibly isolating. And of course, no internet or, TV, which might be good, but they don't have it.
Another question, maybe Larry, but anybody can answer this if you have information. And that, because you mentioned the plague, were mice a problem on ships in terms of helping to create transmittal diseases?
Maybe Hester can answer that. I've never.
The answer is yes. I mean,
vermin of any kind would have been.
Well, the British Navy has a phrase, cleanse or die. And what that really meant was get rid of anything, scrub it clean, hope that you've gotten the pests taken care of. Unfortunately, in wooden ships, it wasn't as easy to do that. And so we're really looking at, vermin were pretty good about hiding themselves, or at least keeping in dark places. The problem also with mosquitoes is the way in which the cargo actually carried the larvae. I mean, it's a complex issue, but I can understand the effort to quarantine, but of course, quarantine really didn't solve the problem. Quarantine sort of helped keep it at distance, but in those areas that came down with yellow fever, the quarantine did not stop the spread. It had to do with basically the dynamic of the relationship between the mosquito and biting the sailors or biting someone who carried it. Because remember, people don't transmit the disease, yellow fever. It's the mosquito that moves it around. And so
right.
It's a question.
So when we talk about the Mediterranean, it's interesting that Larry mentioned that it's, it's the cradle of many aspects of Western civilization. And one of them is the concept of the quarantine as well. 15th century Venice and 14th century Dubrovnik Venice had the quarantine, which means 40 days, which worked for a certain type of disease, which was a plague. And Dubrovnik had the so-called Trentino, which meant 30 days. So there are various aspects of that to be considered. We are in our last minute and we should be wrapping up soon. I just saw a research question that disappeared from my feed. I was going to answer, somebody asked what we can recommend to somebody who wants to do primary research here at our organization at the Maryland Center for History and Culture. I would recommend starting with our website, mdhistory.org. Look around and click on every page you like. And there are plenty of pages with digital resources, with online resources. This program is one of those. And there are always contacts for staff that you can ask if you want to do something further. At the moment, our research library is closed, but we are working on a plan to reopen, and we will be doing that safely, monitoring all recommended regulations. So I just recommend that you can also subscribe to our newsletter. So that way you can get news from us and you can know when we do become available. Hello, Margot. I believe this is our cue.
I just wanted to pop back and say it is time for us to finish our program today. I want to again thank everyone that joined us today, Larry, Hester, Martina, for this very invigorating conversation. The chat was quiet, but I know that there was lots of discussions out there. So thank you all out there for joining us today. We will send out a recording of this program in the next several weeks. So check your email box, social media, and our website. Thank you all again, and we hope to see you for our next program, Maryland Day Trivia.
Thank you.